Hello, family. My name's Betty Guadagno. I'm a grateful person in recovery. I'm a divine spiritual being living a temporary human experience, and I'm going to share about my near-death-like experience with you. So I had a very contrasted life before my spiritual experience. Before coming into spiritual awareness, I was a prostitute. I was a drug addict. I was very impoverished. I was on the verge of homelessness. I was very depraved, and my life completely transformed in March of 2019 due to a spontaneous Kundalini awakening, where I was transported to the space between life and eternity in a non-physical realm, enveloped in unconditional love and blinding white light, the same space that near-death experiencers describe. So let me take you on that journey. Buckle up. So like I shared, my life before was very chaotic. I grew up in a very dysfunctional family. The whole family is a perpetual cycle of addiction and sexual trauma and poverty, and it's just been that way for generations and generations. And it is exhausting being the one to break all the generational curses, I'll tell you. But that's what I'm here to do. So my dis-ease of addiction started when I was a preteen. I saw that when my parents were experiencing an uncomfortable emotion or even a joyful emotion, they would take something. They would take a pill, they would smoke something, they would drink something, and their emotion would change. And so I made mental notes of that. And because I had experienced a lot of trauma in my childhood, I wanted to not feel as soon as possible. And I watched my parents' dis-ease of addiction progress throughout their lives, but I always felt like mine was different. And in 2007, my parents made a decision that they were done with drugs, that they had to end their suffering. And so they did that by committing suicide with one another. I was 23 when that happened, and my sister was 18. We found them. They left notes. They didn't really say much. They didn't actually have to, because somehow I knew exactly what they were going through. I mean, I was dealing with my own addiction, so I understood, like how agonizing that could be. And then my own addiction sort of became my parent in that moment of their death, and nothing was more important than my addiction. I abandoned my sister. I ran away across the country. My life became very chaotic. My addiction came before every relationship, every husband, every job, every apartment, every pet. Nothing was more important than my addiction. So it became my number one companion, my guiding star. And I ended up overdosing in 2019. And I had this Kundalini awakening. And if you're unfamiliar with the term Kundalini, that's okay. So was I. Let me tell you what it means. Kundalini translates roughly into life force. So I had a life force energy awakening. Our spiritual body has 7 chakra systems that operate on the earth plane here. And so in the moment of my awakening, every single one of my chakras became awoken and activated at the exact same moment. So I had this rush of energy going up and down my spine. It was actually causing me to pee all over myself. So half of my awakening was spent on the toilet, which is a funny sentence to say. But as my third eye and my crown opened, my spirit left my body and I entered the space of eternity. And when I started drifting into the space of eternity, I was experiencing something like a life review, and I was experiencing the emotion that I felt in every situation in my life, and then also the emotion of the other party involved. And the main one that sticks out to me was the fact that I had experienced my parents' suicide all over again. Not only from the perspective of a grieving daughter, but also from the perspective of them, and just the absolute agonizing pain that they were feeling in the moment that they made this decision. And it was just so overwhelming. I thought that I would be stuck there in that feeling forever. And I heard these masculine voices guiding me out of the darkness and into the light. One of them was my father, and another was a boyfriend that I had recently passed away. And they just kept guiding me into the light. My boyfriend kept saying, "You are worthy of all the love in the universe." And I just followed his voice, even though I definitely didn't believe that sentence. And I kind of landed on a deck. It almost felt like a spaceship. And there was like hundreds of thousands of other souls around me. And I was being downloaded with my divine mission. And it felt like we were part of some sort of spiritual army. And we were warriors, and we had a commander there, and they were gearing us up for our mission to go to Earth. And it was like all so exciting. And then I kind of look over into a different scene, and there's this table of beings. They have this big, gigantic book, and they're thumbing through it. And they're saying, okay, you're not done yet. You have to get ready to go back. And I'm looking all around me, and I'm like, you guys aren't talking to me, right? Like, I'm home. I'm not going back. I didn't really understand what was going on, but I did know that where I was most certainly home. And I had this great sense of reunion about the entire experience. And they told me that I was a spiritual soldier on a divine mission, and that the first part of my life was boot camp, which is why it was so challenging. And the second part of my life would be carrying out my mission. And I was very dismissive of this idea. And they just kept telling me, like, you have to go back, you have a mission. And they told me all about the spiritual army and all the volunteers that are here. And I was like, wow, that's so exciting. So there's other people on Earth carrying out the same mission. And they were like, yeah, there's so many of you. And I was like, great, they can finish. I'm not going back. I said, I'm going to grab my PJs and a bowl of popcorn. I'll watch the show from up here. I'm not interested in going back. And they said, well, let us take you through the details of your pre-birth plan so that you can understand why your life has been the way that it has been and how it will be in the future. And so it looked a lot like a video game or a movie in my mind's eye. There was a man there, and he was guiding me through my experience. He was wearing a plaid blazer and a fedora. He had a big empty grocery cart, and he was taking me through the aisles of a grocery store, and he said, okay, pick your life. And on the walls of the aisles, there were these big, huge cereal boxes, and every cereal box had a life experience on it. And I could perceive myself as this little orb of light, and I was kind of like, well, if I'm going to Earth, I'm really going to Earth. And I start grabbing every cereal box that I could get my hands on, my figurative hands, there's no literal hands there. And I start grabbing everything: addiction, poverty, sexual trauma, like the double suicide of my parents, picking the family line that I would be born into, homelessness, prostitution. And then there was things in the cart that I hadn't gotten to yet in my life, like overcoming, recovery, spiritual awakening, being an author, being a speaker. And none of these things had happened in my life yet, so they didn't resonate. And so I just thought that they were space filler. I thanked the man for taking me through my pre-birth experience. And again, I told the beings that were these people in charge that were telling me that I had to come back, I said, thank you so much for all this information. It really is so relieving to know that I'm not a victim to my circumstance. I'm actually a divine co-creator of my experience. I had felt so much bondage come off of my spirit and being taken through that video game-like scene. And I said, I really do appreciate it. I am still not going back. Thank you so much for showing me. I will not be returning. And they explained to me that this wasn't a punishment. I wasn't being punished that I had to go back. I had to go back because I signed up to be on Earth at the most exciting time to be on Earth. That we are in the midst of a transformation of consciousness, and the life that I had picked is very specific to that transformation of consciousness, and that I had to go back and complete. And I didn't have to necessarily go back into this body if I didn't want to, but I would have to go back no matter what. And so they showed me the baby that I would be born into if I chose not to come back into this form. And this baby was beautiful, and they showed me everything about her, her ethnicity, her gender, where she would be born, who her parents were, her family line, her life's challenges, her opportunities to overcome, her mission, her purpose, everything. And this baby had even deeper levels of adversity than I had already experienced. She was going to experience many of the same things as me because she was going to complete my grocery cart of life experience. But then there were some even deeper levels of societal adversity. And I thought, well, I definitely cannot start from zero. So if these are my only two choices, then I guess I'll just go back into her. And I kind of found my awareness sifting back into my body. And I remember them saying, trust us, the second half of your life won't be nearly as challenging as the first. And I just said, I do not trust you. I came back into my awareness, and I just wrote the whole experience off as drug-induced psychosis. All I knew was that I had taken a bunch of drugs, and then I thought I was talking to God. And, this just wasn't part of my picture. I was a militant atheist before this experience, and after this experience still. And then the universe started to really shrink down into a very tiny, narrow path so that I had no choice but to admit that my experience was a true one and to start to carry out my divine mission. And so all of these divine synchronicities started to take place in my life. For instance, all the drug dealers that I had been dealing with for over a decade all simultaneously decided to change their lives and stop selling drugs. Like people that did not know each other, and now I had no way to get them. And I experienced a spontaneous healing. I was addicted to opiates for over 20 years, as well as addicted to many other drugs. But the only one that I had a physical dependency to at that time was opiates and heroin. And so I was on day 3 of withdrawal, and I was so sick, and I was welcoming death. And I had this moment that kind of felt like a mental or spiritual suicide. And I heard this very distinct voice, and it said that I could request what I wanted fixed. And I was like in the throes of desperation. So I was like, okay, strange voice, I would like to no longer be physically dependent on heroin. And they told me to count back from 10. And as I did, I visualized these 2 little men in my mind's eye. And they were wearing white lab coats. They had bulbous noses. And they had lawnmowers that manifested in front of them. And I watched them start to walk through the crevices of my mind. And as they walked through, these intense hot tingles were filling it up. And I just knew that something was happening. And when they were done, I felt X's go across my forehead and a plunger on the crown of my head. And as the plunger plunged down and back up, in this bright white flash, I was instantaneously healed out of day 3 of heroin withdrawal. I mean, like moments before, I was sick all over myself, welcoming death. And then within an instant, I was completely well and fine. 1 second before, it felt like my skin and my bones were literally set on fire. And then I was just blanketed in unconditional love and grace and healing. And I threw myself on the ground and I was crying out to God, Source, the divine. And I was saying, how could this be happening? I don't believe in you. I don't believe in this. You could not have picked a more unworthy subject to bestow this kind of grace on. And so after that experience, obviously I thought that I was Jesus Christ. So I went around on the New York City subway system proselytizing, trying to lay hands on people and heal them as I had been healed. And it was very chaotic. And it was quite funny. I'm sure whoever I encountered has a very funny story to tell. And then after that, as it started to settle a little bit, my path became crystal clear. And I was on a train, I had no destination, and a man appeared across from me, and he was wearing a 12-step fellowship necklace. And I heard a voice, and it said, that's your path. Follow him to a meeting. And so I did, and I started my recovery journey, and through some more signs and synchronicities, I found myself in a long-term rehab where I began to integrate my experience and learn how to live life without using drugs or alcohol, which is something that I had never done. And in that process, I had this insatiable thirst for knowledge. I wanted to know everything I could about metaphysics and the law of attraction, and I began to manifest my reality. And I got to go to school and I got certified. I have a job in the recovery field. I stayed in treatment for 18 months, learning how to be a person all over again. And I learned how to ask for help while I was there because I was helpless and hopeless. And in the process of being in that recovery treatment center, I became just completely filled up with hope and knowledge and faith. And I learned how to be of service. And so when I left that community, I found my spiritual communities. And so I belong to 12-Step Fellowship. That's a very spiritual program. I also study the Baha'i faith, which is the world's youngest religion. I study A Course in Miracles, which is a metaphysical text channeled by Jesus. And I also belong to a group for near-death experiencers and spiritual experiencers with the International Association for Near-Death Studies. And I have found the members of my soul family in my communities. And so I think the biggest message that I bring back from my experience, one, is that there's no condemnation. Okay, I was living a life completely wracked in depravity and dereliction, and I was bestowed with grace. And that doesn't mean that, you know, I choose to live righteously today because it feels better. And I don't need to live that way to survive the way that I was before. And so I choose to be of service, and I'm of service in all of my communities. And if you're looking for community, please reach out. My information will be in the liner notes of this video. And I'm very grateful for an opportunity to share my experience. And thanks so much. Be wavy.